Welcome to Check This Out, podcast for kids.
And their grown-ups, where we explore people, places, ponderings, and past moments from history that shape the world around us. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Today, we're continuing our series on
women who changed the world.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg is our subject for this week's episode of Check This Out. Like many of the women we have featured in our podcast, she was a trailblazer.
How, Mama?
Well, I'll give you more details in a minute, but a few ways she blazed a trail were that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the first female tenured professor at Columbia Law School. She was the second woman to serve as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. She co-founded the Women's Rights Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, and she served as the ACLU's general counsel until 1980. She spent much of her career fighting for women's rights and civil rights and became famous for her dissents while on the Supreme Court.
More on that later.
Did you know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has a nickname in pop culture?
No. What?
The Notorious RBG.
I like that.
I like it too. Over the course of her career, she became a bit of a cultural icon. I even have a coffee mug with her face on it, if you can believe it.
You gotta be joking.
Well, I suppose I should tell you a little bit more about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and why we remember her as a woman who changed the world.
I'm excited to learn more.
But first, I want to take a moment and remind everyone to subscribe to the podcast. Make sure you're following us so you're the first to get new episodes and information. And if you know of any other history lovers who you think would enjoy our podcast, whether it's another family or a teacher, please share the word. The more the merrier at Check This Out. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get back to talking about the star of today's episode, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth was born to a Jewish family in New York in 1933.
That was a long time ago.
It was. She was born Joan Ruth Bader. She grew up to become Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she sat on the United States Supreme Court from the time she was appointed by President Bill Clinton in 1993 until her death in 2020.
That's a big job.
It is. Now, before I keep going,
listeners, keep your ears open.
Because at the end of the episode, we will recap 3 facts about Ruth Bader Ginsburg that you can continue to research on your own.
Let's get started.
As a child, Ruth grew up in a traditional Jewish household. She had an older sister who died of a sickness when she was young. Young Ruth grew up going to synagogue and participated in other traditional Jewish events and activities. She was a good student and excelled at her studies as a young girl. After graduating from high school, she attended Cornell University and got her bachelor's degree.
Good to know.
While she was at college, she met her future husband, Martin Ginsburg. They married in 1954. Ruth and Martin eventually had 2 children together. After she graduated from Cornell, Ruth got into Harvard Law School. Do you want to know something crazy about her law school class?
Spill the tea.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of only 9 women in a class of 500 law students.
What? Why does that matter?
Justice Ginsburg was at Harvard Law School from 1956 to 1958. This was a time before gender equality had made significant progress in the United States. Many schools in the 1950s still didn't even allow women to enroll. Along with the other women in her law school class, Ruth often faced discrimination because she was a woman. She was even asked to explain to the dean how she felt about taking a spot in the law school program that should have been for a man.
Oh my goodness.
When you understand that during her time in law school, she was constantly put down for being a woman and had to fight to prove herself, it helps to understand her eventual focus on fighting for women's rights.
Check this out.
If you're listening to this podcast today, you might not even be aware of how much women's rights have progressed in the last 50 to 60 years in the United States.
What do you mean, Mama?
Well, here are a few examples. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed by Congress. This was the first time people were promised equitable wages for the same work, regardless of the race, color, religion, national origin, or sex of the worker. So before that, men could get paid a whole lot more than women for doing the exact same job.
Whoa, no way.
In 1972, Title IX was passed. This prohibits sex discrimination in all aspects of education programs that receive federal support. People most often recognize Title IX when it comes to equality for sports for girls in schools. It wasn't until 1974 that women were allowed to apply for and own a credit card in their own name under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act.
I had no idea.
This same act also allowed women to get home mortgages in their own name for the first time. So before 1974, women could be turned away from getting credit cards or mortgages if it was just them.
How scary.
Up until 1975 and the passing of Taylor v. Louisiana, states could block women from serving on juries just for being a woman.
That's a big deal.
In 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act banned employment discrimination against pregnant women. Before then, women could be fired from their job just for being pregnant.
Huh?
I share all of this because it gives context to the world in which future Justice Ginsburg attended law school. These protections for women would not happen for another 20 years. Some of these actually came to pass with the help of Justice Ginsburg herself.
Oh, that's important.
It is. So now that you have all that context about how recently women's rights have really been enshrined into law, let's get back to Ruth Bader Ginsburg in law school.
Hit me with it.
Ruth and the other women were excluded from lots of things at law school. They were even excluded from certain parts of the library. She eventually transferred from Harvard to Columbia Law School in 1958 for her final year. During her time at law school, she was such a good student that she made both the Harvard and Columbia Law Reviews.
She sounds really smart.
She was, and she worked hard. Even though she graduated at the top of her class, she struggled to find work after law school. Here's a quote from her about that time. In the 50s, the traditional law firms were just beginning to turn around on hiring Jews. But to be a woman, a Jew, and a mother to boot, that combination was a bit much.
Things were not easy.
In 1959, she started working as a law clerk, and she worked in that role for a couple of years. From 1961 to 1963, she was a research associate and then associate director of the Columbia Law School Project on International Procedure. In 1963, Ginsburg began as a professor of law at Rutgers University School of Law, and she taught classes there until 1972.
That's a big deal!
She then served as a professor at Columbia Law School from 1972 to 1980.
She had a lot of jobs.
She did, and that isn't even all of them. She got involved with the American Civil Liberties Union, otherwise known as the ACLU, and helped found their Women's Rights Project in 1971. At the ACLU Women's Rights Project, she was the main architect of a campaign against gender stereotyping in the law. She argued and won 5 major Supreme Court cases during the 1970s for gender equality.
Woo! History.
When she was teaching law at Rutgers, she became pregnant with her second baby. Ruth decided to hide her second pregnancy by wearing baggy clothes so no one could tell she was pregnant. Because remember, this was before the laws were passed that protected pregnant women, so they could have fired her just for being pregnant.
What happened?
But her plan worked. Her contract was renewed before her second baby was born. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter named Ginsburg to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. She worked in that role for 13 years before getting appointed to the Supreme Court by President Bill Clinton in 1993. Do you want to hear one of my favorite quotes from the Notorious RBG?
Yeah!
This is her talking about the Supreme Court. When I'm sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And I say, when there are 9, people are shocked. But there'd been 9 men and nobody's ever raised a question about it.
Wow! I love it.
Me too. She was always looking for ways to promote gender equality. Here are some other fun facts about RBG. After she graduated Columbia, she got a job as a typist, and when she became pregnant, she lost that job. Do you think that may have inspired some of her focus on gender equality?
I think I know the answer.
RBG loved her husband very much, and she has said, "What made Marty so overwhelmingly attractive to me was that he cared that I had a brain." Ruth Bader Ginsburg learned Swedish early in her career so she could work with Anders Bruselius, a Swedish civil procedural scholar, when she was working on the Columbia International Law Project. She actually traveled to Sweden and lived there while working on her project for Columbia Law School. She was also inspired by how Swedish women worked, learned, and contributed to society. She dealt with cancer 5 times in her life. In 1999, she had pancreatic cancer, 10 years later, lung cancer, then pancreatic cancer again, and liver lesions. During that time, she endured chemotherapy, radiation, and in the last couple of years of her life, she was experiencing terrible pain from a disease called shingles.
Ouch, that was terrible.
Justice Ginsburg's time on the Supreme Court of the United States was marked by several key decisions and impacts. She also became famous for her dissents.
What does that word mean?
The word dissent means to disagree. Specifically in the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court decides on a case, they issue what's called a majority opinion. The majority opinion explains why the majority of justices decided to judge the case the way that they did. But in a lot of cases, not all of the justices agree that the decision was right. When this happens, one or more judges will file something called a dissent that gets shared along with the majority opinion. In a dissent, the justices who disagree with the ruling explain why they disagree. That makes sense. In addition to writing many famous dissents, Justice Ginsburg is also known for wearing decorative neck collars that demonstrated when she was dissenting. You can check out pictures of her wearing her dissent neck collars on our Instagram at checkthisout_podcast4kids.
I learned something new today.
One of Justice Ginsburg's early Supreme Court decisions that is well remembered was the United States v. Virginia. This court case was a challenge to the male-only admissions policy at the Virginia Military Institute. She ruled for gender equality. She also, along with the Supreme Court, tried cases about voting rights and the separation of church and state. She stayed on the Supreme Court even when she struggled with health issues and was an active member of the Supreme Court when she passed away in 2020. RBG had a career of overcoming obstacles. She fought for women's rights, trailblazed in new places that women had not historically been represented. She's remembered for her strong dissents and an impressive career as an attorney and judge.
Was there anything she didn't do?
Not really. She kept pretty busy through her life and career.
Let's recap some of her achievements.
True or false? Her law school class at Harvard was made up of all women.
The answer is false.
There were only 9 women in her class of 500 law students. Ruth Bader Ginsburg learned to speak another language while working on her project at Columbia Law. Which language was it? Was it
A,
Italian,
B,
Latin,
C,
Swedish?
If you pick C, that was a super duper good choice.
True or false? Ruth Bader Ginsburg never married and instead focused on her career. This is false. She met and married the love of her life, Martin Ginsburg, when she was at undergrad at Columbia. They had 2 children together and stayed married until Martin's death in 2010. Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked for an organization that advocated for equal rights of others and was a co-founder of their Women's Rights Project. She served as the general counsel for this organization until she became a judge in 1980. This organization was called
A,
the ACLU,
B,
the NAACP,
C,
the SCLC.
Mama, can I guess? A.
If you said A, you're correct. The American Civil Liberties Union, otherwise known as the ACLU, was where Ruth Bader Ginsburg did a lot of her work before becoming a Supreme Court justice. Do you remember which president appointed her to the Supreme Court? Was it A, Barack Obama, B, Bill Clinton, C, Jimmy Carter? The answer is B. Bill Clinton appointed Justice Ginsburg to the Supreme Court in 1993. Great job remembering everything we've talked about in this episode. Now let's recap a few facts about RBG that you can continue to check out on your own.
Here are 3 of our favorite facts.
Fact number 1. Ruth Bader Ginsburg became the second woman and the first Jewish woman to serve on the Supreme Court. Her time on the Supreme Court was marked by strong advocacy for women's rights. Now, follow-up question, I didn't tell you this yet. Do you know who the first woman was to serve on the Supreme Court?
No.
That's okay. It was Sandra Day O'Connor.
Fact number 2.
Justice Ginsburg was only one of 9 women in her Harvard Law School class of 500 students. And while she was top of the class and on Harvard Law Review, she ultimately transferred law schools and graduated from Columbia Law School.
Fact number 3.
When she was younger, Ruth Bader Ginsburg lived a short time in Sweden. She learned Swedish and observed the impact on gender equality that is protected by law, including in law school classes where 25% of the class was female versus the 2% law school class rates in the United States.
What was your favorite fact?
We have a book at our house about Ruth Bader Ginsburg by Little People, Big Dreams. And when Cece and I read this book, I also love the role her mother played in her focus on her education and self-improvement. Her mother died right before she graduated from high school, but the impact of her mother on her life she built was undeniable. We love learning about women who changed the world and the impact their legacy has left on the world around them. We encourage you to continue to learn more about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and why we consider her a woman who changed the world. But before we let you go, you know we don't just love talking about history and cool people and stories.
We also love to rhyme.
Here's a poem we wrote for you about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth spent her life in pursuit of justice. She got into law school and fought against malice. An equality advocate with wisdom so bright, her heart was full of courage, shining the light. From Swedish lands and law school halls, she found her way to the highest court of all. A woman seated in the Supreme Court's fray, she battled for rights in a bold, fierce way. From the ACLU and trying all types of cases, her dissents and impact served many faces. The Notorious RBG, a name we revere, her legacy of change will always be near. Thanks for listening to another episode of Check This Out. Here at the Check This Out podcast, we know there's a lot of information and it can be overwhelming to find accurate information online. This podcast is a tool for you to help you do something called citing your sources. As you get older and do projects for school, you'll learn that certain types of websites or information sources are not verified or have evidence and documentation to back them up. On Check This Out, we use verified sources to build the stories you hear about. Verified sources are materials or information that have been confirmed for accuracy and credibility through an evaluation process. Our sources for this week's episode are womenshistory.org, NPR, supremecourt.gov, the Harvard Gazette, Columbia Law School, PBS, and the Boston Public Library.
Thanks for listening. See you next episode. Don't forget to subscribe.